Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And today we have the great honor of being joined by Professor Mohammad Marandi of the University of Tehran. He, of course, needs no introduction to Gagglers. He's a frequent guest of Crosstalk, and he's also a frequent guest on many other podcasts and TV shows. He was recently involved in a very heated debate with a former BBC reporter who I think now works for Deutsche Welle, one of the German companies. And as in the tradition of BBC journalists, he was asking a series of "when did you stop beating your wife" questions, in which he was constantly making accusations against you, which you then had to, of course, which forced you to defend yourself. And, you know, that's the way these debates are conducted. But the subject during that very heated interview, which was, you know, spread far and wide, was the recent protests in Iran. And of course, he wanted to present it as, you know, horrific, terrible things that were being done by the Iranian government. And of course, he accused you of being an apologist and so on. But you presented a very different picture of what's really going on in Iran, a picture that you know, most people in the West have no idea of, and have no means of access to such information. So, wonder if you could perhaps tell us what's really going on in Iran, and particularly what the West has done to contribute to the protest.
Well, I'd first like to thank you and Peter for inviting me. It's always a pleasure seeing the two of you, and you do great work. And there's no need for me to say more because your viewers know quite well how effective and how reasonable and rational you are in your arguments. So over a couple of months ago, a young lady, we heard in the news that she was beaten to death and tortured, and that she was held by what in the West they call the morality police. Now, initially, I thought that there must have been some sort of police brutality. And I have to point out that the news came from Western Persian language media, like BBC Persian, Iran International, which is a Saudi outlet, and a host of other media outlets that are based in the West. There are actually more Persian language media outlets based in Western countries that are hostile towards Iran than Persian media outlets that exist inside Iran, which is, it's a huge industry. And I think when you take into account the troll farms and all that, they probably are, I would imagine at least 20, 30,000 Iranians are somehow involved in this industry. So it came out, and then you had some of the media outlets inside Iran, which are very Western oriented and pro-Western. And this, of course, goes against the narrative about Iran, where it's a dictatorship and there's no alternative voices. The pro-Western liberal media in Iran, they were also repeating the same claim. So
Mohammed, I'd like to point out to our viewers that it's very, very similar in Russia. A lot of the media here in Russian language is very liberal and pro-Western, just like in Iran. Go right ahead.
Yes, I experienced that myself in Moscow when I was reading, I think it was the Moscow Times or something like that.
Oh,
yes, I was like, yeah, it's the same in Iran. So this young woman, Mahsa Amini, her death caused a lot of anger. And that anger was directed at the police. And so people came to the streets in different cities, not in huge numbers, but in significant numbers here and there in Tehran and elsewhere. And they protested. After a couple of days, the police, being the police, they're slow, but they published video, which showed that when she left the police van, she wasn't handcuffed. She wasn't holding her head. She showed no signs of visible pain. She went into this hall, sat with some other people, and after a while, she got up and spoke to a woman and then collapsed. Then there was the autopsy. So that caused the protests to die down because questions were beginning to be raised about this whole thing and no evidence was provided that she was murdered. But gradually we saw the rise of violence and violent riots, sort of as the protests after 2 or 3 days began to disappear, then we saw or diminish, then we saw the rise of violence. And those violent action groups, they were well coordinated. It was obvious because they were like simultaneously taking place in different parts of the city. They knew what they're doing. But I should also add that after a while, then we saw the autopsy. A number of very famous physicians were involved in the autopsy. They said there was no sign of physical trauma but her father, who lives very close to the Iraqi-Kurdish border and is Kurdish himself, for whatever reason, whether he was under pressure from the Komole terrorist group or whether he was just angry, I can't judge him because he lost his daughter. He was saying that no, the autopsy actually said that she had an operation when she was 8, and that was linked to her death. Now, her father said she had never even caught a cold since she was a child, and then the government felt they had to publish some footage of the father because he was insisting that the government and the coroner's office was lying. So they published him. They published a video where he was standing beside her body and said, yes, when she was a child, she had an operation on her brain, a major operation. And also in the clip, they asked the father, to look at her, make sure, touch her head, and to see if there's he can see if he can find anything that shows that she was beaten. And he basically was saying, no, it's obvious that nothing like that happened. So most people, whether they believe the government position or not, there are more than enough questions raised about the initial claims, let's say, to make people go home, those people who are on the streets. Doesn't mean that everyone who went home, they believed the government version, but it raised enough questions because the accusations those who were making the accusations had no evidence. They put out some evidence that was fake, but the government had presented their case, which looked convincing. But again, I'm not going to swear to it, but I think it's pretty clear that what they were saying is accurate. I know at least a couple of the physicians who were part of the autopsy because, as I said, they're very famous physicians involved. So the protest ended. Then we saw the rise of riots in Tehran and in some other cities. And these riots were very small in number. The protests were, as I said, never very large, but they were significant. There were people there, but the riots were never really large in number. There were sometimes 5 people, 10 people, and there were small teams. Sometimes some people would join them, young kids, people who are angry, maybe they'd increase to 20, 30, 50, but that was basically it. They became increasingly violent as time went by. So we saw a phenomena where police officers and Basij volunteers, they're sort of a volunteer force, they were being killed. They were being knifed, they were being burned alive, they were being hit with cars, and ultimately more than 60 were killed. So imagine if in the UK or in France or in, which has a population that's not completely different from Iran, sort of smaller population, but more or less, let's say Germany, which is, I think the population is about the same as Iran. If 60 police officers or 60 or so police officers were killed, what would the government reaction be? But that aside, and in my Twitter feed, I put some clips of, actually I put one, I uploaded one today, a clip where 2 young Basij members are knifed to death by one of these rioters, these peaceful protesters, as they're called in the West. And I don't do it because I enjoy doing this. It's very painful to watch, but I think it's necessary for people to see what the truth is behind these Western media claims. But more important than the violence, and then of course, alongside the violence and the riots were the terrorist attacks that came from Iraqi Kurdistan by terrorist groups, and from Pakistani Baluchistan, which is a no man's land because the Pakistani central government is so weak. All of these groups are funded by Western governments. Some of them are also funded by regional governments like the Saudis or the Emirates. And then we have the MEK terrorist organization they were deeply involved. The MEK terrorist organization, and I'm sorry for taking so long, but in the 1980s, they killed 17,000 Iranians in terrorist attacks, bomb explosions, assassinations, firebombs. And then they went to Iraq and fought for Saddam Hussein against their own people as foot soldiers. And they have offices across Europe and North America and in Western countries. You can find them everywhere. They have a huge base in Albania, a NATO country, where thousands of their people are stationed. And they have a huge troll farm there, funded.
They have a significant A-list of American and UK foreign policy analysts and people like Giuliani, for example, which is
absolutely. But so they get huge money, and then they give it much of that money to these people who then lobby for them, and then they get more funding. All of these groups are claiming, all of these terrorist groups are claiming that they're involved in Iran. It's not as if the Iranians are making claims and they're saying, no, 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 we're not involved. Because the Western media says, no, this is just, ordinary Iranians. But these groups themselves are claiming to be involved. And we see all these dead people as a result of their violence. And then
it's a form of fundraising. We're active in Iran. It's fundraising.
Absolutely.
It's all the time.
And then on the final note, and probably the most extraordinarily disturbing part of it, of all this, is that this Persian media in London, which made these false allegations about Mahsa Amini in the first place, without providing any real evidence, during this period, they were encouraging violence. They were legitimizing violence. And especially Iran International, the Saudi media outlet, which is based in London, they were saying how burning people alive, knifing them, shooting them, killing them, police officers, is legitimate. So imagine the UK having a TV or a series of TV channels behaving in such a manner, and Ofcom doing absolutely nothing about it. If this was in English, it wouldn't be tolerated for a minute. And these people would be taken to court, especially because not only do they legitimize violence, during this period of time, they've been trying to play on sectarian issues, play on ethnic issues. In other words, they were trying to create division. The BBC Persian, this UK government media outlet, was trying to play on, or create differences between different ethnic groups, and in a country where they claim to be multicultural and to condemn woke, of course, yes, woke. They're woke at home and sectarian abroad. It's divide and rule abroad. So that's basically it. Although I've been the
Persian language media, is it financed by Saudi Arabia, or do the British and the Americans also contribute to this?
It's a very broad network of TV stations, websites, Telegram channels. It's enormous. There are huge troll farms. The biggest ones are controlled by the MEK terrorist organization, others by the monarchists, different Kurdish groups or terrorist groups. But for example, BBC Persian is funded by the British government. and VOA, of course, by the US. Deutsche Welle, Persian, their website is very active, or Euronews, Persian, Radio France International, Persian. Iran International is funded by the Saudis, but it is based in London, and it is the most well-funded of all these huge channels. As far as I know, there's also Manoto and all these others, very hostile, very aggressive, very dishonest, very keen on exploiting sectarianism and ethnic divisions. But Iran International is extremely well-funded. So it's ironic that these people in Iran International, they are working for Mohammed bin Salman, yet they are trying to free the Iranian people from, and you will see like these feminists, these Iranian feminists go on Iran. There was just a clip I saw yesterday where these feminists are talking about women's rights and saying how terrible it is in the region. And then she says, like in she wanted to say Saudi Arabia. She says, and then she stops and says, Iran and how terrible Iran is. So you don't talk about Saudi Arabia on Iran International.
One of the things that's very interesting to me, maybe I'm wrong, but there's something about timing. These things are not coincidental, okay? This is a very well-funded, broad propaganda offensive, because at the same time that this has been going on, Iran is making, by leaps and bounds, progress internationally and diplomatically. I mean, is there a coincidence here? Because when we have, I don't want to talk directly about what's going on in Ukraine here, but I think as George and I have said here in the Gaggle, this is kind of a pivot point where people kind of have to decide what side you're on, because it's the West that is forcing it, and they naively, stupidly, arrogantly thinking that people are going to side with them, but they're not, okay? So we have what George and I like to say, the global majority, not the global South, but the global majority. And I think that, is there a timing issue here? Because as you've said when presented in great detail, this is going on all the time, but Western media picked up these stories because they're happening all of the time. Is there a coincidence?
Here I'm going, some of it will be my own personal speculation. Some of it is based on fact. These groups, these different groups that have been rioting across the country, the ringleaders are coordinated from abroad. They're working with people outside the country. They receive funding. A lot of it comes through Bitcoin and that sort of thing, which can't be easily detected. And the Iranian government knew that something was brewing, especially in this month, because a few years ago we had riots in Tehran because of the previous administration had a sudden rise in fuel, and a lot of poorer people were angry. All back then, of course, the West got involved, but in any case, those protests and those riots were more legitimate, because it was the government had really suddenly doubled the price of gasoline overnight, literally, without telling people beforehand. But that's another story. The previous administration. But the Iranians knew that they were going to try to do something on the anniversary, which was a few weeks ago. It was after the riots began. But my understanding is that they saw the death of this young woman as an opportunity to kickstart it a bit earlier. But also the thing is that they use all of their assets, in my opinion. In other words, during the last few weeks, the Americans and the Europeans have been just doing whatever they could. And here is my speculation. I think it partially has to do with the fact that Iran has been supportive of Russia, even though Iran's position on the war in Ukraine is neutrality and Iran is opposed to war. But the Iranian position is that the major culprit is NATO. The coup in Ukraine, the rise of fascist groups, neo-Nazis, Nazis in Ukraine, the lies that NATO said to Russia about not advancing eastwards, and of course the oppression of Russian Ukrainians and the murder and so on. So the Iranian position was much more sympathetic to the Russians, and the Iranians have been helping the Russians to how to circumvent sanctions, and they are establishing a north-south corridor through Iran. So that has angered NATO, obviously. But I think it's also, and this is where the speculation comes in, I think it's also linked to the fact that in the past, Iran was the evil. It was like their focus was on Iran, even though China was on the rise and Russia is larger than Iran, but their focus for a host of different reasons, their sheer hatred towards Iran, the revolution because of the Israeli regime and all that, they are very emotional about Iran. So they've been investing a lot on Iran, whether it's the media, whether it's terrorist groups, whether it's riots, or whether it's troll farms and all that, and bots and so on. But I think that they also probably felt that after this, they really won't be able to repeat this with the same magnitude in future, because they are on the decline, economically speaking. And also they have much more, they have bigger fish to fry. They have Russia and Ukraine, they have the war in Europe, they have China, which they're increasingly antagonizing. So the focus that they used to have on Iran is going to be divided. And of course, you have the changes taking place in Latin America. I just feel that the Americans and the Europeans felt that now is the best time to see what they can do, especially with the Russians and Ukraine and the war not going well despite all the propaganda in the Western media.
But
that's my understanding.
Yeah, but I wonder if that's true. I mean, that's a kind of almost an optimistic view, because as Peter pointed out, Iran will probably be a member of BRICS quite soon. The Russia-China-Iran partnership, it's going to become, it's becoming a strategic partnership, and Iran is now more and more able to withstand sanctions. I mean, you remember the JCPOA and then the American withdrawal and the secondary sanctions were supposed to bring Iran to its knees. It was not on its knees. Iran doesn't really care that much now, returning to the JCPOA, not returning, it just doesn't matter anymore. So I just feel that Iran's still going to be in the crosshairs, because Russia's in the crosshairs, China's in the crosshairs, and Iran is very much a part of that triumvirate.
But I think that just to reiterate what George was saying is that now it is a strategic bloc. Okay, I think that's real. Okay, and it's recognized. Okay, and when you see like when Erdogan shows up in Tehran, I mean that is something that is a nightmare for NATO. It is a nightmare for the West, which of course we all enjoyed watching. Okay, because it just shows how hollow and cheap and thin this their entire presence. For me, it's just how do I put it, like postmodern neocolonialism. It's neocolonialism gone woke, which is just so bizarre. Okay, but it seems to work with these elites, but it is completely contradictory for the global majority, and I think that they know they've lost the argument.
Yes, and that's why I'm. What I was saying, it really doesn't contradict what George was saying. I believe that their hostility towards Iran is just as much as it used to be before. But obviously the amount of money that they have to spend on Ukraine, the amount of money for decades, Iranian studies was a big thing in the United States and in Western European countries, because so much focus was on Iran. And Russian studies, which used to be very big during the Cold War, in fact, something which you know quite well, it declined for a very long period of time. And this is just one example. Now they're going to have to, or they will, not that they have to, but that's just how they do things. They're going to have to refocus on Russian studies. They're going to have to spend more money demonizing Russia, infiltrating Russia, the same thing in China. So their resources are only so much, and therefore what I mean to say is that they are going to have to spread their resources out, and it's going to therefore be more difficult for them to sort of amass the amount of resources that they've been using against Iran in the future. Those resources are still there, but I just think that it's going to be more difficult. And I think that they thought that this was a good time to push very hard, especially because, as you both rightly point out, that Iran is now a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or about to become officially a member soon. Parliament just, I think, yesterday passed all the documents and the relevant texts that need to be approved by Parliament. So it will go to the Guardian Council. So ultimately, Iran will become a formal member. And then I think, as you pointed out, Iran will ultimately join BRICS as well. So, and I was in Uzbekistan a couple of months ago. In fact, I was in Uzbekistan when this young lady passed away, Mahsa Amini. And that's where I heard the news. I was with the Iranian delegation to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. And what I witnessed myself was that Central Asia was very keen on developing a north-south corridor through Iran to do trade with India, to do trade through the Persian Gulf, East Africa. The Iranians and the Russians are working on their own north-south corridor that goes through the Caspian Sea, but also through Azerbaijan. And then, of course, there's the Silk Road, or the Belt and Road initiative, where the Chinese are also working with Central Asia, Russia, and Iran. So, and the talks between the Iranian president and the Indian president was also very important, because India is also now has a renewed or an increasing interest in Iran, because they want to do trade with Russia, they want to do trade with Central Asia, and they have to do it through Iran in order for it to become meaningful and for the goods.
Well, another thing that's happening is, if you look at Saudi Arabia, in this kind of, I think it's overdone in Western media about how the Saudis are rebuffing Biden and OPEC plus and all of that. But it's, as much as Saudi Arabia wants to see regime change in Iran, it's just like, it's like a sickness that they have. It's irrational. It's just something that we've always done. This is our great devil that we have to be. But the facts on the ground say a very different thing. Okay, is that the Saudis have a very good constructive relationship with the Russians, for example. Okay, and I think that the Saudi leadership enjoys personalizing politics. When you do that, it doesn't usually work, but they do that anyway. And they're making a statement vis-a-vis the West. They want to become some kind of independent vector. We'll see how that goes. But you can hate Iran all you want, but geopolitics goes on. Okay, and the future for Saudi Arabia and the other royal families in the Gulf, their future isn't with the West; it's with the East.
Yes, and ultimately, Iran's problem with Saudi Arabia was because of Yemen. And we have to remember that Obama gave the Saudis the green light to attack Yemen. And it took place during the 2015 nuclear talks. And I was there as well during the negotiations. Obama gave that green light basically to compensate for the negotiations in Vienna with Iran over the nuclear program. But Iran's problem with Saudi Arabia was basically about Yemen. When the war came to an end, the Iranians the relationship between the two countries potentially can improve. It's this personalized politics, as you put it, of Mohammed bin Salman that I think impede normalization, because through trying to promote or let's say push for this Iran international TV channel and antagonizing Iran in the way in which it does, he's not helping himself. But ultimately, I think you're right. The Saudis will have to come to the recognition that the United States is a declining power. European countries are, I don't
By
even know
choice,
how,
by
I don't
choice,
even
they're
know
in
how to
decline, by
classify
choice.
them. Yes, exactly. So, and as the war in Ukraine goes on, it's going to get even worse. And of course, I think because of a host of issues, the 2008, 2009 crisis, the crisis of capitalism, quantitative easing, the way in which they dealt with Corona, and a host of other reasons, the United States and the Europeans are destined to decline. And the Saudis are going to have to face the facts of that. And so we'll have to see how that plays out in the future. But Iran, and this is one of the interesting things that I regularly have to deal with my liberal colleagues in Iran, with my pro-Western liberal colleagues, and we have quite a few of them on campus. You have this image of Iran, just like women. I mean, they say, as George was pointing out earlier on, have you been beating your wife today? My boss at the University of Tehran, the dean of my faculty, I've been a faculty member at the University of Tehran. My faculty, I've been in it for 20 years now. The dean of the faculty for those 20 years, 16 of those 20 years was a woman, 2 different women. So my boss at the University of Tehran for almost my whole 20-year period as an academic here have been women. So these stereotypes, we have to cast them aside. But I think that in general, what these liberals in Iran, their central argument has been is that why are we shifting towards China? Why are we shifting towards Russia? And I always respond to them and say that, look, it's not just China and Russia. It's Central Asia, it's India, it's the whole of Asia, it's the whole of the global South. It's any country that wants to be able to independently decide to do business and to have cultural and political interaction with Iran. It's Brazil, it's Argentina. When the United States and the Europeans shut the door, it is the most idiotic thing just for us to sit behind that shut door and pray for it to be opened one day. You go and search for open doors, those who welcome you, and you work with them. And in fact, if you're successful in doing them, and if you create a successful network with Iran and Russia working together, Iran and China working together, Iran and Uzbekistan, and Iran and Iraq and other countries working together, you create a situation where the West has to rethink their foreign policy. And that brings about a situation where for their own self-interest, they're going to have to open the door ultimately. But if they feel that all these different countries are small islands and they are isolated, whether it's the Russians, whether it's the Iranians, whether it's the Venezuelans or anyone else or the Chinese, then they'll just continue with this policy of strangling nations until they get what they want. So the smart thing to do is for all these countries to come together, work together, to network, to strengthen themselves so that Western countries come to the realization that they're the ones who are losing out. It may take time, but it will happen.
Well, that's very interesting what you say, because the Western policy is to sow division. I mean, Biden says the world is divided between democracies and autocracies. I mean, that's been his message throughout. I mean, that's it. That's the big division in the world today, and the Western media repeat this. Now, if the Republicans win power in 2024, we know that they have a visceral hatred for Iran. I mean, it's not just Trump, but whoever, whether it's DeSantis or anyone, they absolutely hate Iran. They're absolutely, they're much more fervently pro-Israel than the Democrats. So again, you have the division, and then you've got also the Western woke liberal opinion, which has embraced the whole. I mean, like the feminists who have now, we're against Iran because this woman has been murdered by the Iranian authorities. So suddenly all the Western feminists hate Iran. So it's the West, whether it's you go from the left to the right, they foster division. They live for dividing the world into the enlightened and into the unenlightened.
Yes, and when one looks at it, the narrative on Iran and the narrative on Russia and the narrative on China is all very similar. How barbaric they are, how backward they are, how crude they are, how stupid they are, how incompetent they are. Even in the war in Ukraine, when you see how they depict the Russians and how as if the Russians are unintelligent and incapable of even waging war, they all have a very similar pattern. It's all one and the same, and that's why it's so easy to mobilize these feminists, because this latent Orientalism, this latent knowledge about Iran and the other is always negative. And even though the argument can be inconsistent, it's still believable. So, for example, Putin Russia is collapsing. Russia is on the decline. The economy is collapsing. But Russia is a rising threat. Russia is a threat to the whole of Europe. Russia has failed in Ukraine. It's lost the war in Ukraine, but Russia is a threat to the whole of Europe. I mean, these arguments are inconsistent. They're paradoxical and they're irresolvable, but they're all believable because they're all about a very evil Russia. So
yeah, but what happens is, you're absolutely right. And so these narratives, these are false narratives, these are contrived, politically motivated and ideologically informed narratives, but these narratives are wrong. And the same narrative inform very bad policies. And this is the dead end that the West has created for itself. It has an incorrect narrative and it acts upon that narrative because as we've all agreed right here, is that you know the literature, the world beyond the West. You've already described it to us. Is that forget those guys? I'll go talk to you. Let's meet over here. Let's talk. Okay. No ideology. We want some trade. You need some trade. We need some trade. Let's not do it in dollars because those nutcases in Washington will mess with us. No, these are happening simultaneously. The West, Joseph Borrell is the perfect example. He's just walking in a circle talking to himself.
Absolutely. And the thing is that if they even thought in a rational way, they would see the inconsistencies in their arguments. I mean, you cannot be losing a war in Ukraine yet be a threat to Europe. If you're either losing the war in Ukraine or you're winning the war. If you're losing, then you can't be a threat to Europe. Or, for example, Iran is a terrible regime. It's unpopular. The people hate it. It's incompetent. These mullahs, I don't even know what that means. I mean, when you look at the cabinet and parliament, there are very few religious scholars or clerics, but these mullahs, these crazy people, they don't know how to run the country. They're evil. The regime is imploding, yet it's a rising threat to the world. I mean, come on. If it's imploding, then it's not a threat. You should be waiting for it to fall apart and then pick up the pieces. But they don't think rationally, even though they pretend that they are the rational thinkers. They say that the global South, the non-Western world, they are irrational, but we're rational. But when you look carefully, they're the most irrational of us all. And actually, Peter, I would add that these non-Western countries, when they work together, it's not only business, it's also an issue of morality. Yeah, I believe that these countries see the most immoral entity as NATO. NATO is the most, let's say that the Russian war in Ukraine was completely unprovoked. Forget the coup, forget NATO lying and moving eastwards, forget the oppression of Russian Ukrainians, forget all that. Let's say it was just an unprovoked war. Well, what about Iraq? What about Libya? What about Yemen? The list goes on. It goes from Vietnam till now. Then the sanctions, the brutal sanctions against ordinary citizens. people recognize across the global south. They may not have a lot of information about Russia. People may get their information from Reuters. They may get their information on Iran from from CNN. But they all know that there is something wrong. They know that they have this history. So if it's immorality, then those countries that are the most immoral of them all are these NATO regimes. And therefore, I think that the Iranians and the Russians and others can work together and feel very comfortable, actually, about dealing with the right sort of people, because the countries that have caused the most, I mean, look at West Asia. Look at the region where they've destroyed this whole region. They've destroyed it from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean, from Iraq and Syria to Yemen. Look at Libya, the most ridiculous case, the country which had the highest standard of living in the whole of the African continent, completely wrecked and destroyed. And wrecked and destroyed as we speak today. So they have no moral standing for them to say, the Iranians and the Russians are, they're working together, but look at the Russians violating human rights or the Iranians violating human rights. No one violates human rights the way in which NATO countries do.
Well, it brings up an interesting point, and it's something that George and I have talked about repeatedly, is that the West has this intense phobia. Again, Joseph Borrell is a very good example, is that there is an alternative to the way they think. There is an alternative to neoliberalism, and that's something they can't. Because neoliberalism is a cult, okay, and they cannot even begin to fathom that someone or a group of people could think differently. And Iran, Russia, China, India, these are conservative countries. Okay, all through South America and Central America, these are conservative countries in their cultural values. Okay, and then these countries are socialist. So I would argue you hear this in American media all the time. It's ridiculous. Okay, it's infantile debating, but it's the West that has isolated itself because of its ideology. The rest of the world's not very ideological.
Yes, they are the most ideological, and they're the most supremacist. You don't see the sort of supremacism elsewhere that you see in there. I mean, when you speak of Borrell, this is a guy who just a few weeks ago said, "We live in our garden, and the rest of the world is a jungle." That's basically what he was saying.
He said it twice. He said it.
And which is so utterly racist. And yes, first of all, in your garden, you had the First World War and the Second World War, and you had all sorts of wars during, most of the wars were in your garden. But beyond that, the colonialism, the destruction of the global South, where did that come from? Who encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade Iran? Who gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons? Who helped create extremist groups in Afghanistan to encourage the Soviet Union to invade? We know now from Brzezinski himself that he and Carter agreed to support these groups so that the Soviet Union would invade. So the support actually didn't come after the invasion. They wanted to create a Vietnam. This is how these entities function. And when you think, and it's sort of like, and it's all over Western literature, Hollywood, all of it is based on this. The West is a garden. It's sort of like the Shire and the Lord of the Rings. And of course, that it was a very Cold War novel, the Lord of the Rings. Russia was, of course, the Soviet Union was Mordor, and the Shire was England. And of course, Borrell's whole notion of the European garden, it falls within that supremacist context. And it's not going to work, because after the Second World War, I may have my numbers, I'm not accurate with these numbers, but the US economy was like 50 to 60% of the global economy.
Yep, it was.
I'll stick to 50%.
50 is fair. 50. Most people say 50.
Well, the United States today is only 14 or 13% of the global economy, and it's declining. And collectively with Europe is declining. So they no longer have the stature and the capability and the resources to keep other countries down. And simultaneously, these other countries are rising. So Russia today is not Russia post-Second World War. China today is definitely not, it's not China of 30 years ago. Iran over the last, I mean, when Iran began to develop its military program, just as an example, Western countries would ridicule it. Now they're talking about Iranian drones and missiles, so the world has changed, and they have to come to this, they have to begin to comprehend this, because if they don't, they're going to lose the most, because these countries are moving.
What they have is two things. They have a printing press that, putting themselves forever into debt that will never be paid off. And they have this bogus ideology. Well, it's not enough. It's not going to cut, it's not going to cut the mustard. Okay. As you said, and then the economies that they have is financialized. It's not even a real economy. Okay. Real things. Okay. Or in particular, in the case of Germany, less and less so, because Germany's great ally, America, is doing everything it can to deindustrialize Germany and steal their industry. I mean, they have two things. They have the printing press and a bogus ideology. It's not enough.
And this, I think, goes to what George was saying. I mean, George, when you were saying, like, what about 2024? And if a Republican comes to power, the problems that the United States and the European Union has is not simply Russia and Iran and China and India and Central Asia and Africa and Latin America, but it's also this ideology and how it's divided their own countries, and how they have created a divide between the elites and the rest of society. And the impoverished, they claim to be woke and multicultural, but under Obama, African Americans, they were worse off than under Trump. The gap between the wealthy and the poor in the United States, especially minorities in the United States, grew. So neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party is providing answers for the American people, because neither of them, I think, are responding to the needs of ordinary people in the United States, or the bulk of the reason. In my opinion, again, I may be wrong, but I think the reason why Trump became president of the United States, even though he's in many ways a buffoon, and of course I dislike him immensely, especially because of the murder of General Soleimani. But the reason why he came to power was because of Obama. Obama, when he became president, I know people who in the United States, my friends, who are very critical of the political regime, of the deep state, of the establishment of the United States, and they wept when he became president, because they felt, even though they were skeptical, they felt maybe there's hope. But what did he do? He did the same thing that previous presidents of the United States did, and which increased the divide. The bailouts, one of the first things that he did was the bailouts, and he helped to further destroy the middle class of the United States. So in my opinion, by the time we get to 2024, the United States is going to have more problems than Europe is going to be who knows where Europe is going to be in 2024. But the United States, despite benefiting to a degree from Europe's decline, I think the problems in the United States will increase significantly, and the United States will have to start thinking about problems at home more than.
No, I agree. And what's interesting is that it's from the Republican side that we get some noises about, hey, we should, focus on our domestic issues, America first, make America great again, and so on. I mean, to the extent that there's any opposition to this blank check for Ukraine, it's coming from the few Republicans. The problem is with those Republicans, the one thing they're not going to stop on interventionism is Iran. I mean, you go to somebody like, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz. I mean, as soon as you mention Iran, they just They just go crazy. So the irony is that even among the non-interventionists, the people that you might, as you said, like the ones who had hope over Trump, Trump is just completely irrational. He said some sensible things about Russia, at least during his campaign. But on Iran, he was, completely crazy. I mean, so, Soleimani walking out on the JCPOA without provocation and so on. But so even with this kind of non-interventionists among the American leaders, on Iran, it's a total blind spot.
Well, it also shows that empire is just a bad habit. I mean, all of these things are irrational. I mean, if you start, digging to the core, like an onion, every single layer, it's all irrational. Why? I mean, if you don't want a blank check for Ukraine, then why have we been in a proxy conflict with Iran for the last 40 years? Does anybody remember? Anybody remember why we're doing this? Empire is a bad habit. Okay.
One of our mutual friends, Alistair Crook, when I first met him, maybe 15, 16, 17 years ago, it was at a conference in Beirut, and I remember we were sitting after the conference, like maybe over dinner or over coffee, and I was saying, well, why is the European Union doing this? Why isn't, I'm saying this works against their own interests. And then he said to me, Mohammed, and I was younger back then. I was maybe 39 or I don't know, 40 or something like that. I don't remember. But he said to me that. Mohammed, your mistake is that you think that these decision makers in Europe and the United States, they're rational. They're very emotional. They're very irrational. And then again, a few months later, I remember seeing him again at another conference, and we were having the same discussion. And again, he said, Mohammed, I told you once before that these people are not rational. They're very emotional. Their hatred is very deep felt and immense. And that is basically, what you're saying. They're even Russia, whether it's Russia, China. I mean, let's look at China as a good example. So the war in Ukraine begins, and the Americans and the Europeans want to destroy Russia. They want to beat Russia. So you'd think the smart thing would be for them to go to China and say, look, we have our differences, but let's be friends, let's work together, and can you help us with this Russia thing, right? But no, they go and start provoking China. They start going and sending people to Taiwan. They start making the Taiwan a bigger issue. How irrational can you get?
That's a very good point.
No, I mean, I remember, when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. I remember, George, I think we did it on the same day or the day after. And she shouldn't have gone. She should go, and all this ridiculous binary, stupid conversation. And George and I, we out of the gate, we said, okay, a visit's fine, but why? What do you want to achieve? Well, there was nothing to achieve. Okay, so that was just a ridiculous genuflecting to somebody, but it had nothing to do with foreign policy prowess. I mean, George and I said, yeah, a visit, but why do you want to go? What's your point? And so it was just like, no, that's how irrational it is.
Yeah, it's sort of like, we're king of the hill. It's like, it's that, they want to sort of, I don't know, maybe it's like a Suez moment, when the British, when they felt that their empire was declining, they had to show how powerful they are. And what happened was that they exposed how weak they are in reality. So the Americans on the one hand go and they start provoking China, and then they also tell the China, let's work together. And the Chinese are like, what? So, and that's how they deal with all these issues. Their hostility towards Iran, their hostility, they destroyed their relationship with Russia because of Trump. They destroyed the relationship simply because Hillary Clinton couldn't accept, or they couldn't accept, that Hillary Clinton would lose to a buffoon. And the reason why she lost to a buffoon was because she was such a horrible person, but even more importantly was the fact that the political establishment of the United States was so vulnerable that some showman could just come and win the election. That was completely, so they had to find some nasty. I mean, if Russia is so powerful, then what is this war all about? Just submit. If they choose your presidents, then I think you.
What's interesting is,
I mean, if they're so powerful, then why didn't the Russians re-elect Donald Trump?
that's right. But what's also interesting about your point about rationality, that in both cases, they've got themselves into a fight with Russia on an issue in which there are no Western interests at stake. I mean, Ukraine is not a member of the EU. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. There was never no real reason to get so involved in Ukraine. And the same with Taiwan. I mean, again, what difference does it make to the United States or anyone in Europe whether Taiwan is incorporated within China or maintains a certain independence from China? So on both of these issues of Russia and China, actually, the West isn't pursuing in any way rational interests. I mean, it really is just a kind of emotional, as if this is some big issue for us, Ukraine and Taiwan. Why?
They have no interest. Ukraine itself could have had the best of both worlds. They could have been both with Russia and the EU, and the regime chose to destroy the country. And the Europeans, they have no interest in the war. And this war, neither do the United States. But the point is that the United States, as a supremacist regime, as an exceptionalist regime, has to be at the top. It can't be sitting at a table with peers. It has to be at the head of the table. And so the divorce between Europe and Russia has to happen. So Nord Stream, the pipeline, who knows who blew it up? From what we're being told,
We'll never know.
Yeah, the Russians bombed their own pipelines. The Russians bomb their own the nuclear power plants that are being held by their own soldiers. The Russians have a history of just bombing themselves, apparently. It's a pattern. But the Americans, the only thing, my reading is there are two things. One is that the Americans just want to separate Europe from Russia. They want to separate Europe from Asia, because it would remain the American sphere of influence, even if this means the ruin of Europe. And of course, the inevitable ruin of the EU, because the EU is not going to last under such circumstances. But that's okay for the Americans, because even if you look at it rationally, the Americans don't benefit from this in the long run. Some people say the Americans are the big winners. They're not winners. How are you a winner when your allies are wrecked, when your allies are ruined and your adversaries are growing stronger and growing closer? I mean, just as an example, the war between Russia and NATO right now, it's effectively a war between Russia and NATO. The north-south corridor that goes through Iran, this wouldn't have been established. This wouldn't have been a big issue for Russia or even Iran if it wasn't for this war. So when this war comes to an end, is this corridor going to go away? Of course not. So it changes the way in which global trade takes place altogether. The Europeans and the West, the collective West, is removed from a significant segment of this trade. This is going to be the long-term consequence. And this is just one. I mean, the internet, financial institutions. There's so many things that are being discussed right now between Iran, Russia, China, Central Asian countries, other countries that are working together and trying to develop ties to circumvent Western financial institutions. The world is going to change dramatically. So the United States is not a winner, but a lot of this is emotional. They have to be top dog, and the Russians, of course, the Iranians, they hate them. They had this irrational, even when the Soviet Union collapsed. And again, I don't want to go into areas where the two of you are much better informed than I, but Russia, for a host of reasons, became a miserable country, and they were begging to be a part of the West. And instead of accepting them, and if they had accepted them, the Russians would have fallen in love with them, they tried to destroy them. They tried to cheat them. They tried to, whether through insurrection, in Chechnya, using the Wahhabi groups there, or financially, and they tried to direct Russia. But why? Because it's because of that otherization. It's because of that. Even the Iranians, when the Iranians helped free hostages in Lebanon before Hezbollah was created. The Americans slapped Iran in the face. The Iranians gave an American company, for the former Conoco, an oil field in the Persian Gulf. Then they were slapped with sanctions. The Iranians helped the Americans defeat Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Then they were the axis of evil. And then, of course, the JCPOA. The Americans violated the deal from day one. So it's because the Americans.
Well, and to add to it, one of our favorites is that remember the Obama's red lines about chemical weapons in Syria, and so the UK Parliament, voting, that was a fiasco. No, we don't want to go.
We don't want to go there.
Obama got cold feet. The Russians came in, pulled his chestnuts out of the fire, and then a few months later, regime change against a democratically elected government in Kiev. So, I mean, what are we supposed to take from this?
And of course, General Soleimani, you mentioned Soleimani, and Soleimani was, if ever there was somebody who was fighting against ISIS, it was Soleimani. And, and how does Trump express his gratitude? He has him, assassinated.
I mean, General Soleimani, without him, you'd have black flags over Damascus, probably Beirut, and probably in Iraq, and probably in some of these countries in the Persian Gulf, and it would be but that's how the United States works. Or the coup in Kiev. The coup in Kiev, I think, is just reflective of the emotional hatred of the United States.
Yeah.
And the people behind it, their total disregard, not just for Russia, but even for the EU.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I can't use
Victoria Nuland.
Yes, Nuland, the language that she used in her phone conversation. It's obvious. They don't care.
But I want to ask both of you. I mean, there's something you said, and I think it's really interesting because one of the historical events of the past that people love to invoke, which most people don't know what it means, but they love invoking it anyway, is Munich and appeasement. Most people have no idea what they're saying. They just invoke it. But you mentioned the Suez crisis, and I think that works more because I think you see, a hegemony being challenged on all fronts. And so every moment is a Suez crisis. I think that's really what's going on here. These neophytes that invoke Munich, I can remember watching MSNBC and someone mentioned it and he started saying, yeah, it happened in 1936. I mean, you don't even know the date, okay? And you're still invoking it, okay? But I think to your point, and I think I'm going to use this more often, is that for the West, every day is Suez.
Yes, I agree. They have all these Suez moments, but they still don't see what's happening. Because in Washington, they live in a bubble. They don't even understand what's going on in the United States. Homelessness, the collapse of the middle class, they really don't get it. And it's going to hit them hard. I can't say when, but we're heading towards a crisis that is probably unprecedented in its own way, even in ways perhaps worse than the 1929.
Well, I mean, George has mentioned in the kind of banter that we have about it, and I'm kind of moving more into George's corner here. They have one thing left, Mohammed. They have coercion. And yes. I think that's the scary thing. They will use more and more coercion to keep people in line because they can't win on arguments. I mean, it's really quite remarkable if you look, particularly in the United States, but I think in the Western world it applies as well, is that there's a complete institutional capture, media, entertainment, education, the works, okay? It's all elite capture ideologically, but there's still, particularly in the United States, a 50-50 breakdown. There is still enormous resistance to these people that are really ideologically possessed. That's a recipe for disaster because the only way you're going to be able to have those institutions maintain their power is to use coercion.
But the problem is, of course, that they have to use coercion at home increasingly too, because their ideology is not only detrimental to the rest of the world, but it's detrimental to so many people in their own society. They've driven, and what will happen in Europe after this war ends? What sort of economic, are people going to continue accepting the status quo? Who knows? What I can say is that some of the most despotic regimes in the world, like the United Arab Emirates, as long as they have a lot of money, a lot of people are going to remain quiet, even though the people at the top are taking the most of the money. But people are more or less satisfied with their lives. They have enough. With the United States in the 1970s, regardless of US foreign policy, the 1960s, regardless of Vietnam and the Korean War and all that, inside, regardless of how they treated African Americans and minorities, but the United States had a huge middle class. Mm-hmm. The power of the United States, in my opinion, was because of its middle class, because of its strong middle class. That doesn't exist anymore. And so the status quo is unsustainable. And when people have less to lose, and when they don't have anyone there to give them hope for social justice, to bring about greater, to expand the social welfare network, or to give them some sort of hope, and people become more desperate, then I think it's going to be more hard for the United States and Europeans to impose their will on their own people. So,
well, I mean, and to add to that, the latest wrinkle, of course, is how people vote, which is whimsical right now. There's no longer election day, there's election month.
But that's the thing, that in terms of force, we've seen that governments, Western governments, are pretty ruthless when it comes to the use of force, much more ruthless than the authorities of Iran. I mean, we saw some of that during COVID.
Russia.
But but we can see also, now, I mean, how they respond to the truckers and so on. These governments, they have the media, solidly ready to repeat whatever the propaganda line is. And I say, these are white nationalists, these are racists, these are fascists, these are Nazis. Whatever we do to them, it's is not enough. And which is why I think that there's been such intense animosity towards Elon Musk. Twitter was part of that. I mean, it's part of that, that government propaganda machine. If you lose Twitter, that's a real problem, and that's why I'm not at all sure that Elon Musk is going to pull this off, and I think the government is going to come after him. But that just shows that the government are serious about coercion, and the media, control of the media, is very much part of that.
Yeah, although I'm not a fan of Elon Musk, and I don't think his intentions are benign, but the fact is that you have these cracks emerging in the United States. It's no longer this political establishment where the Democrats and the Republicans and everyone is on the same page, and big tech, they're all in bed with Washington and with DC. Now you see these cracks emerging, and Musk, for whatever reason, he is I can see him sort of working within that context of America, of a United States that's fragmenting at the top. Again, I'm not saying the United States is going to collapse or there's going to be a civil war. I have no idea what the future holds for the United States. I do know that it's a very troubled country, but I don't know what the future holds. But coercion can succeed if there is, it has the potential to succeed when there's consensus at the top. And I don't know if there's going to be consensus at the top anymore in Europe or in the United States or in Canada with what's going on, because the more people become impoverished, the more difficult life becomes, and the more the ideological divide expands, with woke, 50% woke and 50% whatever, then I think these countries are going to have more problems awaiting them in future. And meanwhile, by antagonizing everyone else, they're going to push all these countries together. And again, and here I'm going to speculate again. So they're pushing Iran, Russia, China, and others together, which is fine. I mean, they work, the better they work together, the less effective the sanctions. But one of the reasons why Western countries are successful is because they had more power, therefore they had more capability to influence other countries, to intervene in other countries, to invade other countries. But what if they, during the decline and as these divisions emerge in the West, what if the reverse happens and then you see foreign powers doing what the Americans and the Europeans have traditionally done through NGOs, or what they've been trying to do in Iran, or what they did in Iraq 3 years ago, use their NGOs to overthrow Adel Abdul Mahdi, the prime minister, or what they've been trying to do in Russia. I was in Russia once when these liberal opposition people were protesting and so on. It was clear who was backing them and what the ideology was and all that. But what if the balance of power shifts, and then you do see these countries start thinking about, well, maybe we can do the same thing in the United States? Not the foolish claims that were made about Russia and the 2016 election, but real influence, not necessarily from Russia or Iran or China, but from a host of Mexico, but from every country doing its own thing in the United States for its own interest. What if that begins? I don't think that's impossible.
I think most countries that we're talking about really do believe in non-interference, but at the same time, China, for example, has figured out the American DNA, money, okay? And because Americans, I mean, from the very highest echelons of society will sell out their country just for money, okay? It's very clear, and it's bipartisan. That's why it's not investigated.
That's what NAFTA was.
Sorry?
That's what NAFTA was.
Yeah. Okay.
Sold out the country.
Well, what I'm saying is that I am agreeing with you, but it would be Western elites that would collude with these forces. Okay, their morality is so benign. Okay, because I mean, we've George and I've talked to a number of people. What will it take for a America First agenda really to take on? And and some of the people we've talked to, very interesting, very intelligent, but they really don't want to go to the fact that it's bipartisan. You can buy off all of these people, and they'll sell everything and everything whatsoever. In that sense, that is their ideology. It's just me against everyone else. They don't care about the country. They don't care about the country's history. It's because if you really want to have an America First agenda, you have to have a decoupling with China, and it doesn't have to be aggressive. Okay, but if you're not willing to, if the NBA just says, well, no, we're going to choose China over America, that's what you're going to have.
And just one small example about the United States. The United States is supposed to be, these people are supposed to be working for American interests. Forget NAFTA, forget the fact that they changed all the laws so that US businesses all went to China and China became the factory of the world. Forget all that. When the Americans are voting about Iran, or when they vote about Russia, you always get, like in the Senate, 100-1, or 99-1, or 100-0. Isn't that supposed to be what these authoritarian countries like Iran are all about? Isn't it like when in Iranian parliament, like everyone is going to vote, like, we do this to the United States? Or Russia, isn't it supposed to be all the Russians saying, yes, we all raise our hands and say, comrades, let's destroy America or whatever. So it's always 100-0. And in Congress, it's 460-1. With a few people.
But what you said is, it's not just Iran. I mean, like expansion of NATO. There isn't anyone, one person, one senator who's going to say, I think this is a really lousy idea. I think it's going to endanger American security. I think it's going to lead to war. It's going to lead to nuclear conflagration. Not one. Yeah, 100-0. We're all on board for Sweden and Finland to join NATO.
And on top of that, the people in the mainstream look at George and I as somehow extremists for even suggesting what George just said. But there is a huge literature, academic literature out there. I mean, George and I didn't come up with the idea, maybe it would be a bad idea. It's ever since the end of the Cold War. It's been discussed at the highest levels of academia. And the consensus is it's probably a bad idea. George F. Kennan on the way down, but it doesn't seep into policy. We're made into extremists because we take a mainstream position.
Exactly. And I mean, when Mearsheimer, his lecture on Ukraine suddenly went viral after the war, people thought he spoke after the war began.
It was 10 years, 8 years before.
They didn't look at the date. This was almost a decade earlier. Why? Because he was looking at it logically. He was looking at it through, he was reasoning. He was saying, look, if you do this, these are going to be the results. And why would you do these things in the first place? What purpose does it serve? But again, I think, to be simplistic, it goes back to exceptionalism. It goes back to supremacism. It goes back to the fact that they have to keep everyone down instead of, to keep them down so that they can remain king of the hill. It's pretty crude and pretty primitive, but and that's, people may find it difficult to believe because this is the 21st century and that we have cell phones and laptops and all that, but that's basically how it is in my view.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammad, and this is a really fascinating, wide-ranging discussion. So thank you so much for giving us your time and for giving us the benefit of your insight. And we look forward very much to your returning to the Gaggle very soon. So thank you again. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.